So you want to get to the heart of things right, cut through the noise, and really understand what's going on.
Well, that's what we're here for.
We're diving deep today into a fascinating conversation with Tim Urban.
The mind behind... Wait, but why?
Exactly where complex topics become surprisingly clear.
And often pretty funny, too.
This interview, I mean, it was huge, covered a ton.
So we've extracted what we think is the essence.
The key ideas.
And those questions that are really at the forefront of his thinking right now.
And that's what we're going to explore with you today.
What's always struck me about Tim's work is that he takes these massive subjects,
Like really big ideas.
and manages to break them down into pieces that we can all grasp.
Makes you feel like you can actually wrap your head around it.
So with this summary, we want to give you that same experience,
The core of his current thinking.
without having to sift through hours of conversation.
So one of the first things that really jumped out at me was this story about how he ended up with a tortoise.
A tortoise.
Yeah, named Winston. Back in 2005, he was actually on his way to a pet store
Right.
to buy a betta fish for his office.
Oh, okay.
But he saw these tiny tortoises, and it was just instant.
Really?
He bought one on impulse,
Wow.
and now all these years later, he describes their relationship as complicated.
Complicated how?
Like, he's this dad who abandoned him but also loves him.
That's kind of hilarious.
It's a funny little story, but it gives you a glimpse into that spontaneous side of him.
You can definitely see that impulsiveness in the range of topics he explores.
Absolutely. And speaking of explorations, let's talk about his current book project, which sounds absolutely massive.
I've heard about this.
He's on chapter 17 out of 17.
So, almost done then.
You would think, right.
Ah,
But here's the thing. That final chapter, The Futures,
futures plural.
exactly, is shaping up to be about a quarter of the entire book.
Wow. That's a statement.
Talk about going out with a bang.
It really highlights where his mind is at right now.
For sure. And this Futures chapter, it's a real mix of everything.
Like what kind of stuff?
Well, he's looking at AI for one,
Okay.
but not just the AI we're seeing now. He's considering AGI,
Artificial general intelligence.
right, within the next maybe 3 years,
Hmm.
and then ASI.
Artificial superintelligence.
Yeah, the really big one.
I can see why that would take up so much space.
He even had this analogy comparing our current AI discussions to monkeys talking about bananas while inventing humans.
That puts it into perspective.
It's a whole other level.
Definitely.
And he made a point of saying he didn't want to start the book with ASI.
Why not? It seems important.
Because it's such a fundamental shift, it would overshadow everything else.
That makes sense. You need to lay the groundwork first.
But that's just the beginning of the futures.
Yeah.
He's also got 5 different areas of transportation trends he's looking at.
5.
Yeah, 5. Humanoid robots, cultivated meat.
Now that's something I'm interested in.
Oh, yeah. And then there's biotech and advancements in health span.
Things like CRISPR.
CRISPR, transcription factors, bioelectricity.
That's the cutting edge stuff.
It's all about manipulating our biology, potentially extending our healthy lifespans.
Wow.
And then on top of that, you got energy infusion, space exploration, brain-computer interfaces.
This is getting pretty sci-fi.
He even touches on extreme longevity,
Like living for hundreds of years.
potentially even thousands.
It's mind-boggling to think about.
But it's the way he approaches writing about all this that's interesting.
What do you mean?
He actually said that writing about the future is easier than the past
Easier how?
because you can't really get concrete facts wrong.
I guess that's true.
It's all about exploring possibilities.
But it's still a huge amount of information to process.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's a different kind of challenge.
More about connecting dots than sticking to a fixed narrative.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the future. Let's zoom in a bit, shall we?
Okay, where are we going?
To the microscopic level.
All right, I'm intrigued.
Tim talked about how the complexity within a single biological cell really captivated him.
I can see why that would be fascinating.
He used this incredible imagery to describe it.
What kind of imagery?
Well, he talked about zooming in on a cell
Okay.
and finding not just this basic unit of life,
Right.
but a metropolis of molecules. This place buzzing with activity, almost chaotic.
Wow.
He used this analogy of Pong, the video game.
I remember that one.
But imagine the smaller and smaller you make the ball, the more frantically it seems to move within that same confined space.
That's a great way to visualize it.
That's what's happening inside a cell
Constant movement.
at incredible speeds.
And it led him to this realization
Oh, is that?
that if you could zoom in on what he's made of what any of us are made of,
Mm-hmm.
It's this world of molecules and electromagnetic
It
forces.
makes you question what it means to be alive.
Exactly what defines life.
Is big question.
They touched on the scientific criteria.
Things like reproduction.
Reproduction with heritable traits, so passing on those characteristics.
Makes sense.
The capacity for Darwinian evolution,
Right.
adapting to the environment,
Right.
and maintaining homeostasis.
When-
Essentially keeping the internal environment stable, taking in energy from the outside to work against entropy.
So kind of like a constant battle against disorder.
Exactly. And they contrasted this with something like fire.
Fire.
Yeah, it reproduces by spreading, but it doesn't have heritable characteristics in the same way.
Interesting point.
It's not passing on a blueprint like DNA does.
So fire is not alive.
Not according to those criteria.
That's a very specific definition.
And it gets even more mind-bending when you consider emergent properties.
What are those again?
How complex behaviors arise from these basic interactions.
Right, like consciousness arising from neurons firing.
Yet all of this is governed by electromagnetism.
It makes you wonder about free will.
Now there's a rabbit hole.
Definitely a topic for another day.
So Tim admitted he hasn't gone super deep into the free will debate himself.
But I'm sure he has thoughts.
Oh yeah, he understands why people argue against free will.
Because of physics.
Exactly. If everything is just atoms and forces interacting according to fixed laws,
Then where's the choice?
it feels like an illusion.
But a very powerful one.
He brought up Sean Carroll's idea of poetic naturalism.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that.
It's the idea that while the universe operates according to physical laws,
Right.
there can still be valid and meaningful descriptions of reality at different levels.
Like a different lens to look through.
Exactly. And free will could be seen as a poetic description of human behavior.
Even if it's an emergent property,
Right. It's useful at our level of understanding
it helps us predict behavior.
and create models of how people interact.
So it has value, even if it's not real in the strictest sense.
And Tim believes that a world where everyone truly believed in no free will would be worse off.
It's a bleak thought.
And probably impossible given how we experience the world.
Our brains are wired for agency.
He even had this thought experiment about everything being a ricocheting of the Big Bang.
So predetermined from the start.
But we don't feel that way, do we?
It's a fascinating paradox.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Tim's writing process.
Always an interesting topic.
He reflected on his previous book, A 6-Year Affair, he called it.
That's a long time.
And he believes that, with what he knows now, it could have been done in 3 or 4 years, maybe even 2.
What changed?
Well, he talked about his delusional optimism.
Delusional.
Yeah. He was always thinking he was just a few months away for years.
I think a lot of creatives can relate to that.
It really messed with his work-life balance.
It's hard to switch off when you feel that close to the finish line.
And he realized that the lack of a true panic monster was a problem.
Panic monster.
That's his term for deadline-induced pressure.
Ah, I get it.
He was so used to that from his blogging days.
Weekly deadlines, immediate feedback.
It's a very different beast from writing a book.
Much slower, more solitary.
And he admitted he'd become reliant on that adrenaline rush of publishing regularly.
It's a hard habit to break.
But it sounds like he's developed a much more structured approach now.
Tell me more about that.
He uses a chess timer to separate dedicated work time from free time.
Interesting.
About 4 hours of focused work.
And then freedom.
Exactly. It creates accountability, and it taps into that teenage psychology of work, followed by reward.
It's like tricking your brain into being productive.
And he's really strict about tracking his time resetting if he gets distracted.
It sounds intense.
But effective.
It's all about finding what works for you.
Absolutely.
All right, let's get into something a little more controversial.
What do you have in mind?
The political heat map.
Ah, yes, the one with the avocado versus steak analogy.
Right, supposedly illustrating liberal and conservative moral circles of concern.
The idea being that liberals supposedly prioritize outer layers like animals or distant people more than their own families,
It's a bold claim.
and one that Tim found completely absurd.
I see why.
He pointed out some major issues with the study itself.
Like what?
Well, for one, the sample size was small.
It's not a good start.
And then there was the way the data was presented,
How so?
using a 2D map with 3D heat to represent a concept that's essentially 1 or 2-dimensional.
That sounds confusing.
It was very misleading.
So you couldn't really draw clear conclusions from it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what frustrated Tim the most was the lack of critical thinking,
People just accepting it at face value.
because it fit their existing narrative.
It's confirmation bias at its finest.
He did acknowledge that there might be some underlying truth to the idea that conservatives prioritize their immediate in-group more.
And liberals are more outward looking.
But to say that Libras literally value a fish over their own family.
That's a
A
stretch.
huge stretch.
There's nuance that's missing.
And they also brought up the different meanings of concern,
Meaning?
whether it's just awareness of an issue or a commitment to take action.
That's an important distinction.
And Tim's takeaway was that we need better truth-finding mechanisms.
Instead of just resorting to tribalism.
And we need to stop using exaggerated and untrue versions of opposing viewpoints,
It's about having honest conversations.
even when it's difficult.
So let's talk about wokeness.
That's another one that's sure to spark some debate.
It's been a dominant force in culture.
And Tim believes it likely peaked around 2020, 2021.
After the events surrounding George Floyd.
Right, and his observation is that some people who previously voted for Obama have started to recognize what they see as its illiberal tendencies.
Interesting.
They see it as clashing with core principles of civil rights and classical liberalism.
So a shift in perspective.
He also pointed to a recent trend of more reform liberals and reform Jews becoming vocal in their opposition,
Leading to real changes.
like some DEI departments being dismantled.
Which he initially thought would be more permanent.
But he also expressed concern about the potential for overcorrection,
Meaning,
that the anti-woke movement could itself become a form of illiberalism,
the kind of mirror image.
potentially exploited by grifters and people with bigoted agendas.
So the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction.
And he worries about that happening too quickly.
Driven by understandable frustration.
To analyze this better, he introduced the concept of a vertical axis.
A vertical axis.
Yeah, a spectrum beyond the traditional left-right.
Interesting.
It focuses on things like a commitment to truth-seeking versus tribalism.
So are you focused on finding the truth or just scoring points for your team?
Exactly. And also, liberal versus illiberal methodologies.
How you go about achieving your goals.
And he argues that this framework is essential for identifying problematic trends on both sides.
It's about looking beyond the surface level labels.
He emphasized the importance of being willing to critique your own tribe.
To say intellectually honest?
He used the analogy of, wait, but why? Impersonators spreading hateful ideas.
That's a powerful image.
It's about being vigilant even within your own group.
And he mentioned Elon Musk calling out anti-immigration sentiment within his own sphere.
But he also sees the risk of the anti-woke movement mirroring the excesses of the woke left.
Leading to another backlash.
It's a cycle.
And social media probably amplifies it.
Oh, absolutely. It accelerates everything.
Speaking of different cultural contexts, Tim had some interesting thoughts about the UK.
We were those?
He noticed a concerning lack of free speech protections compared to the U.S.
With the First Amendment.
Right. Congress shall make no law.
It sets a very high bar for government intervention.
He was surprised to learn the UK doesn't have an equivalent.
It's a very different approach,
More about balancing free speech against potential harm,
which gives the government more power to censor.
especially during times of cultural upheaval.
He even mentioned a case where someone could potentially face prison for private messages deemed toxic.
Thought policing, essentially.
It's a slippery slope,
And he connected this to the history of indecency laws in the UK.
like the cases of Oscar Wilde and Alan Turing.
Tragic examples of how these laws can be misused.
And the irony is that the UK has expressed regret for those persecutions.
Yet they seem to be repeating the same mistakes,
He traced these laws back centuries,
showing how our definitions of indecency change over time.
and he ended with a somewhat pessimistic view of Europe, including the UK,
What was that?
that they seem to be lagging behind the US in pushing back against authoritarian tendencies.
And he worries about the erosion of freedoms without enough resistance.
It's a sobering thought.
Definitely something to consider.
So to wrap things up in true Tim Urban fashion, let's do some rapid-fire predictions.
I like where this is going.
Probability of his current book edit being on time, 37%.
Not great odds.
Likelihood of him writing another 100,000-plus word book in his lifetime, 90%.
I'd say that's a safe bet.
Within the next 10 years, 70%.
He's a writing machine.
Likelihood of external intelligence like God or a simulator existing 10%.
So he's not ruling it out.
Likelihood of advanced life existing elsewhere in the galaxy, 70%.
Seems plausible.
Likelihood of widespread use of brain-computer interfaces by 2050, 68%.
That's not too far off.
Likelihood of humans living to 200 years old, 12%.
That would be amazing.
To 5,000 years old, 2%.
Okay, now we're getting into sci-fi territory.
Likelihood of civilization surviving beyond 2075, 80%.
I like those odds.
And finally, his probability estimate that probability itself might be the wrong framework for thinking about existential risk, 15%.
What does he suggest instead?
A more action-oriented approach he calls camps.
Camps.
Just do it, basically.
Interesting.
He touched on the idea of hyperstition.
The power of belief to shape reality.
And it all comes down to the tension between trying to predict the future probabilistically.
Versus the influence of our beliefs on that very future.
It's a fascinating feedback loop.
So to sum up this digest of our conversation with Tim Urban,
We've covered a lot of ground.
from tortoises to the future of humanity,
We've explored the microscopic world inside a cell.
and the vast expanse of the cosmos,
We've grappled with free will.
and the challenges of staying intellectually honest.
It's been a whirlwind.
But that's what makes Tim's work so compelling,
It challenges us to think differently.
and to engage with the big questions.
If you enjoyed this summary and want to stay informed about future deep dives,
We encourage you to subscribe to the podcast.
you won't want to miss what's coming next.
We'll see you soon.
Until then, keep exploring.